This is Seeking Delphi, episode number 16, Options for Future Human Evolution. I'm Mark Sackler. The future lives here. Evolution is not something that one generally associates with options. It's something that changes organisms by chance and adaptation. That's biological evolution. But there's also cultural evolution. It's what's in our minds, what we create with our skills, our habits, our tools, our arts, our weapons, and so forth. But looming on the horizon, and the very near horizon at that, is a new kind of evolution. It's technological, as we're on the verge of using technology not just as an aid to our lives, but to change our beings, both physically and mentally, and possibly change the very meaning of being human. MIT physicist Max Tegmark says essentially this in his new book, Life 3.0. But he's not the only one. In her forthcoming book, futurist Linda Groff lays it directly on the line by calling it Options for Future Human Evolution. Groff is Professor Emeritus, Political Science and Future Studies at Cal State Dominguez Hills and Director of Global Options and Evolutionary Futures Consulting. She joins me today from her office in Playa del Rey, California. Linda, welcome to Seeking Delphi, and thank you for joining me.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Linda, let's start with some of your personal background and what brought you to your current project on human evolution.
Yes, well, I'm working on a book called Options for Future Human Evolution, and I have been a long-time futurist. I had a background in international relations, and then I discovered future studies right after graduate school, and I thought this is what I've really been looking for, because you can do more big picture thinking and systems thinking and how things interrelate over time and so on, and bring in consciousness things as well as technology, environmental issues, all kinds of things, culture. So basically, having done this for a long time, this is my own synthesis right now of what are some of these key issues facing humanity today. And I think, one of the theses I have is that we had the agricultural age, the industrial age, the information age, and now we're in another big period with major change again by a bunch of new technologies, also crises the Earth is facing, which is our home that we live on, all the diversity of humanity interacting more and more and needing to figure out how to do that more positively, the need for us to evolve our consciousness and thinking and worldview if we're going to respond to all these problems in a good way. And also that humans are leaving the Earth to go to space and whether we'll find life in the universe. So I have a different section of a different chapter of the book on each of these different areas. And I think that we have accelerating change happening in all these areas. And we have major issues facing humanity, including ethical questions and some people say existential issues, like with artificial intelligence and so on, about whether what it means to be a human being even is changing going forward. And other issues are whether we're going to all evolve as a human species in the same direction. There's just all kinds of interesting issues being raised by all these issues. But I'm trying to say that we need to look not only at all the new technologies, which I'm also doing and raising huge issues, including infotech, biotech areas, and so on, but we need to look at going to have an Earth here that we're preserving. And do we, how do we, and this is one other issue that I think is really important. And I guess it's my little challenge to transhumanists, who are one version of technology people who, say we're going to become transhumans or beyond the regular human we are, is before we madly dash into all the technology, which we're doing anyway, but we need to also ask, what is it about being a human being that is important that we want to preserve going forward? And I don't think the technology people always ask that question. And whether, so anyway, I could go on and on, but that's a little introduction. So I'm a big picture person. My brain always wants to put a big picture together. So this is my effort to do that.
Well, you and I are similar in that way, being big picture people. So before we drill down to some of the details of your work, let me ask you a big picture question. Darwinian evolution, biological or social, is not something we direct, at least historically. It's something that changes us more by chance, not something we control. So tell some of our listeners who might not understand how we have options, how do we come to have options now?
Right. No, that's a good question. I'm also using evolution not just as Darwin's biological evolution, which a lot of people do, but as physical evolution of the universe. Then we had biological evolution of species, and life came into existence, and still big debates about that. Then we eventually got from that humans coming to exist, where we create culture and our products of culture and learning. And then there's consciousness, where we can wake up and become conscious of all the ways we've been programmed by all these things and start to act more consciously in the world, or co-create the future with all these changes happening, and so on. So that's all part of it. But I think what people are saying today is we're going beyond Darwinian biological evolution, where things work through natural selection, where members of a species that can adapt to a changing environment more effectively can procreate and then change their own species going forward. But what's happening now is that humans are intervening in our own future evolution in ways that are changing the future that we are creating for ourselves, and raising all these big issues, many opportunities, but also important questions and challenges. So we're not just products anymore of this natural evolutionary biological process of adapting to changes in the earth by different species, but we're consciously co-creating our own futures, and at an accelerating rate. So we really need to look at what we're doing and what are the values underpinning this, and what are the important choices we need to be making, and even how can we understand everything we're creating that we're in the middle of.
Well, some of these choices, one would assume, since you're talking about evolution, actually mean choices that might change what it means to be human, both the meaning of life, but also the physical, biological, be it through technical or technological or biological means. What's your view on that?
Yes, it's happening. This is the big issue that's being raised by a number of these technologies, whether infotech or biotech or whatever, is what are we changing what it means to be a human being? Now, people who love technology, and I like technology a lot, I read science articles every day and so on. Sometimes technology people get so wrapped up in the technology that's all they see. And I'm trying to say we need a broader context to also look at this. Yeah, but some of the technologies, I've come up with 11 technologies I've been looking at. And there are more, but these are really important ones. But different versions of transhumanism, which are people who want to, their underlying motivation, which is really interesting, is to seek immortality. They believe that they can do it with the aid of technology. And so one version is Ray Kurzweil uploading his consciousness in a computer chip when the singularity is reached, and he thinks the machine will run at a faster speed than our biological brain can do anymore. Another version is biotech, where we want to keep our body, augment it as parts wear out. And a third version is we become a cyborg in the future, where we become a mixture of the human, biological human, and the machine. And so those are different versions. There's other huge debates today about the impact of robotics and then artificial intelligence as the brain of a robot, or just on its own, possibly becoming more and more intelligent, and could it supersede human intelligence, and how do we deal with that? And then there's huge biotech revolutions happening, like stem cells and cloning and stuff like that. But the biggest thing in that area is this new CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technology, which could help people who have a genetic defect that could be very positive for them. But the other thing is that it has the potential to go in and change what's called the germline, which is what we pass on to future generations, which could be the egg, the sperm, or the embryo. And if we can edit that, then we have the potential to create designer babies, designer families, raising all kinds of other ethical questions. Do we want to do that? What traits would be selected? Who gets access to this technology and who doesn't? So you have issues of technological haves and have-nots. So, all this is happening. And then in addition, the internet is evolving very fast, and we're talking about the Internet of Things, or everything, and so that we're more and more connecting different sensors on our body with sensors throughout the environment into one big, huge interconnected whole. I mean, some people think, well, is this becoming like the Borg, or and it could be hacked, but this is another thing happening. And virtual reality is another thing, where you can put on the head thing and experience any different kind of alternative reality as in an immersive environment where it seems very real to you. And then raising the question, what is reality itself? If you can experience it, it's real to you. And 3D printing is another thing happening where we can move in the future towards more localized, low-cost printing with more and more different materials that are inexpensive. And so these are affecting our whole economy. And there's another big issue with robotics, whether it's replacing jobs going forward or whether new jobs will be created to replace the old ones. But a lot of people are concerned that there may be less jobs in the future, and then we may need to move towards a more serious discussion of a guaranteed minimum income or universal basic income, UBI, because you can't have a sizable number of people in societies that are unemployed and have that socially tenable. So there's just all these huge issues on the horizon that all of a sudden we're needing to start dealing with. And so one of the theses of my book is also that we need a lot more dialogue between different areas of technology, between the technological people, the environmental people, the civilization people, the consciousness people, the space people, etc., because all these areas get interrelated as well, and they're all happening with accelerating change impacting us. And we also need a lot more discussion between so-called experts in different areas and the mass public to get people more prepared to start addressing some of these questions. So that's kind of my motivation behind this whole thing.
Well, creating and enabling that dialogue is very much the motivation for this podcast, not just this one, but the entire series. So clearly, we're talking about evolution by choice rather than by chance. You talk about 5 major areas that these options fall into. We've already talked about technology, both infotech and biotech. You also list civilization, consciousness, Earth and sustainability, and spaceflight, or space and ET. So what about, to begin with, Earth and sustainability?
Yeah, a few key issues in each of these other areas that need to also be addressed and included. So in the area of the Earth, I have a whole presentation on this, but we've entered what's called now the Anthropocene age, which is a new geological age that they now think began around 1950. And it's characterized by human dominance of the Earth to such an extent that the so-called wild areas of nature where animals used to survive, are now all getting mixed in with the so-called civilized areas where humans live. And so you get animals in human areas and humans destroying animal areas, so their own habitats, are being destroyed because we're taking over more of the Earth. And then as a result, many species are in danger of extinction today. So some people think we're in the 6th mass extinction of species on the planet. And then another humongous issue is global climate change. And, the thing is, we've got to, it's already, the goal is 3.5 parts per million CO2, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but we're already at 4 and, there's huge negative consequences for all different parts of the world if we don't start dealing with that. So that's a really critical thing. And we have people who are climate deniers, but after all the recent catastrophes and from hurricanes and so on, people really need to start waking up, and we need to start consciously preserving areas for animals if we want them to survive. We can't just assume they'll find areas on their own anymore. We have to actually set aside areas for them. That's a conscious thing again, and we need to consciously start dealing with climate change. Those are just a couple things. We need to move towards renewable energy instead of non-renewable fossil fuels that pollute the air and create more CO2 in the atmosphere and more global warming and so on. Those are just a couple things in the Earth area. So
let's see. The next one then you list is civilization.
Right. Well, in that area, I've taught stuff for many years also in intercultural communication, interfaith dialogue, and, the dialogue of civilizations and so on. But all the diversity of humanity, all our different races, ethnic groups, cultures, civilizations, which are groupings of cultures with things in common, or religions and faith traditions are all interacting with each other. So we can't go forward in a positive, peaceful way. I've also done peace studies for years. If we don't start finding ways to see diversity as a positive thing and look at the strengths that different traditions can offer to humanity as a whole today, and be open to learning from each other's traditions and not think that any one tradition has all the answers, but so that's another big topic. But I also think humanity organizes at bigger system levels over time, and that's also happening today. So all of that is happening, and we need to figure out how to deal with our diversity in more positive ways, I would say.
Fourth one you list is consciousness. How would that fit into options for evolution?
Well, I mean, that interrelates, I think, probably with everything is consciousness, and I've also been interested in some spiritual questions for years. But the big question is about consciousness is, can we wake up and become conscious and co-create our own futures, which we are doing more and more, but we need to have I think a big part of that to me is also that we need to develop a more interdependent worldview. If we want to solve environmental issues, if we want all these new technologies to be introduced to society and to the earth and so on in ways that are positive and not destructive, and so on and so forth. So one of the things that's interesting to me, if you look at like Eastern, Western worldviews and indigenous and so on, if you look at Western worldviews, back to Aristotle, we said something's either A or B. So we got stuck in this thing that, well, therefore we're individuals, we're separate from each other, we're separate from nature, so we want to control that. We're separate from God is on high, not within us. And then also we're, even our scientific method is divide reality into separate parts. So in the West, we need to get back to a more interdependent worldview and not get rid of diversity, but see that diversity as interdependent and interacting with each other. And then I spent a year in Japan one time and 3 months another time. That's much more of let's say, a collective culture. There, they could maybe use a little more individualism. So, and indigenous people, most of the non-Western world, Eastern cultures and all, developing countries and indigenous cultures are more of a collective worldview of interdependence. So, we need to somehow figure how we can bring all these different worldviews and cultural worldviews together as well, and in a way that honors our different traditions and is open to learn from them and create something together that takes the best from each tradition, including spiritual traditions and consciousness ideas. So to me, consciousness involves partly this idea that everything's actually interdependent and evolving together in this created universe. The last area is space that I'm also looking at, because we are leaving our home planet to begin to explore our solar system and the universe beyond. And this is another huge and fascinating topic, but the really fascinating question is, are we going to encounter life in the universe, or are we alone in the universe? Maybe the universe is populated with life. And in either case, people say we should go to space. Some people, like Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk and others, say that we need to go to space in case we destroy the Earth through climate change or warfare or whatever. There's an interesting hypothesis that if the universe is populated with life and any kind of life emerges somewhere in the universe and it evolves to the point that you get like a version of something like humans, more who can become more self-aware and conscious, and also become what's called a technological civilization that can evolve to the point that they can begin to leave their home planet. But then there's always this big critical question about whether that more advanced technology will be used to get them out into space in a positive way, or whether it will be used and turned against other members of your own species, and then you can self-destruct and basically never become a spacefaring civilization. So that to me is really interesting, because that's exactly where we are right now on the Earth. So that's another big challenge that we're facing, I think, is if we go to space. And there's something in the human spirit that also seeks to explore the unknown. And of course, space is the final frontier, so to speak, or at least a very big one.
Well, I'll tell you what, you and I are both, giving away our ages, both old enough to remember Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. And I think one of the most profound thoughts I ever heard about that, and I don't remember who said it first, was when it was compared to Columbus landing in America. Somebody said, no, it was more like the first biological creature crawling out of the sea up onto land. It was an evolutionary step, not a
Yes.
civilization step.
I mean, it was an evolution like this, a species even changing, like a fish coming out, using his little fins to develop legs and start to walk on the land and come out of the sea. And, there's other examples of that type of evolutionary jumps, like when the great apes came down, or, primates out of the trees and started going from 4 legs to walking on 2 legs. There's lots of different, another example is when mammals develop, which feed their young through milk, and some mammals on the land decided to go back to the sea and become porpoises and things like that. So, evolution happens when species face changes in their environment. And if you go to space, that's a big change, because we're not biologically built to be living in space without a lot of things like space suits or space colonies to live in, and artificial gravity and all kinds of things. So, but we want to do it. Humanity seems to want to go. And so one of the big focuses now is Mars missions. And there's different versions of that. There's NASA 2-way mission. There's Elon Musk also wants to go to Mars. There's also another group called Mars One, which wants to send people on a 1-way mission. It's a private effort, and which NASA can't do that. They've got to bring people back. But there were 200 volunteers for that, and then they narrowed it to 100. And so there seems to be something in our human spirit for some people, that adventuresome spirit, I guess you could say, that wants to explore the next frontier and break down barriers and do something new and extend our species. Yeah.
Well, Linda, this all sounds very interesting. There's a lot of stuff here. I'm sure the book is going to be quite detailed. I'm looking forward to it. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Options for Future Human Evolution is sure to be a fascinating and wide-ranging read. And even as the ethics of artificial intelligence continues to be a technology hot button, we need to consider very carefully a bigger technology issue: how, when, and particularly if we should alter our own physical and intellectual being. Linda's book is bound to be a must-read for anyone wishing to address these issues. In future-related news, even as self-driving cars are being designed for the ground and flying cars are being designed for the air, comes a wave of hovercrafts being designed to travel quite literally somewhere in between. Hot on the heels of Russian concern Kalishnikov unveiling the first prototype of what it calls a hover bike, one Yuchen Chai, a student at London-based design school Central St. Martin, won a hover car design contest co-sponsored by Renault. It uses maglev technology to travel a foot or so off the surface. I have to admit I'm not clear on what the advantage of such a vehicle might be other than saving on tires. Unlike a flying car, it can't go over the traffic. Perhaps it could go off-road around it, I suppose. Speaking of self-driving cars, a U.S. Senate subcommittee has unanimously passed a bill to enable autonomous vehicle development in the U.S. by standardizing regulations nationally. Speaking of self-driving cars, a U.S. Senate subcommittee has unanimously passed a bill to enable autonomous vehicle development in the U.S. by standardizing regulations nationally. The bill previously passed the U.S. House and is likely to pass the Senate to become law. For once, Congress actually seems to be ahead of a public, the majority of who still mistrust self-driving vehicles. And finally, even while serious stories about robots and artificial intelligence multiply, comes this silly gem. A sex robot created by designer Sergio Santos was so damaged by over-exuberant attendees at the Arts Electronica Festival in Linz, Austria, that it had to be discarded. It lost digits and was twisted out of alignment. That's ironic. Anything Picasso might have painted that looked like that would have been worth millions. Links to these stories are available on the Seeking Delphi webpage for this podcast. And as always, you can subscribe on iTunes or Player FM and follow us on Facebook. Thanks to my guest, Linda Groff, and to you for joining me. My technical assistant is Mohammed Maroof, and until next time, I'm Mark Sackler.